late November 1944. Somewhere east of the Ruhr River, a German sound-ranging team waits in the freezing mud of a forward observation trench to a battery of German 1.5-centimeter heavy howitzers waiting in the rear. Minutes later, the heavy shells tear through the overcast sky. 4 steel tubes. The FDC remained entirely intact. The moment the German guns revealed themselves, the FDC simply pivoted. The men in the tent shifted their plastic scales to the surviving battalions to the north, west, and south. They calculated 3 different ballistic trajectories simultaneously and transmitted them across the wire. The FDC could mass the fire of 36 scattered guns as easily as it could command 4. But a centralized brain and a web of radios only solved half of the tactical equation. Mathematical processing speed is useless if the physical weapons cannot survive long enough to receive the order. The German observers knew exactly how long it took to pack up a heavy European howitzer. You had to dig out the massive recoil spades, roll up hundreds of yards of wire, hitch the gun, and drag the weapon out of the freezing mud. It usually took hours. Even if the American FDC could calculate a retaliatory strike in seconds, the physical cannons firing those missions should have been sitting ducks for the next wave of German counterfire. The observers watched through their binoculars. A cluster of dirty black explosions erupts exactly over the plotted coordinates. Secondary detonations follow. To understand why the American guns were rarely where the Germans expected them to be, we have to look at what those cannons were attached to. The freezing mud east of the Ruhr River gripped everything, but it could not hold the American artillery. Instead of a team of draft horses and exhausted men struggling for hours to pry the heavy steel spades of a howitzer out of the frozen earth, a different sound echoed behind the American lines. The grinding roar of a 6-wheel drive GMC truck, the famous deuce and a half, cutting through the slush. The truck reversed toward a 105mm cannon. The crew lifted the split trails, dropped them onto the truck's pintle hook, and locked the towing mechanism. The artillerymen threw their camouflage netting and gear into the wooden bed, climbed aboard, and the engine revved. Within minutes of firing their last shot, the entire physical battery vanished down a scarred dirt road, leaving behind nothing but empty brass casings and deep tire ruts. The German observation battalions based their entire mathematical worldview on the assumption that artillery was static. They had to. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on millions of horses to move its cannons and supply wagons. Once a German battery dug into the European soil, displacing to a new location was a slow, agonizing logistical hurdle, the telltale signature of ignited ammunition. The American guns abruptly cease firing. By every law of gunnery, when a German sound rangers calculated a grid coordinate, they operated on the safe assumption that the enemy target would still be sitting in the same mud when their heavy counterfire finally arrived. The United States military did not share this limitation. The American Army was fully motorized. Every cannon, from the standard 105mm field pieces to the massive 155mm long toms, possessed a dedicated prime mover. Whether it was a heavy truck, a half-track, or a specialized high-speed tractor, the engine replaced the horse. This mechanical reality birthed a doctrine that broke the old rules of the artillery duel: rapid displacement. American batteries could pull into a clearing, drop their trails, fire a heavy mission, hitch back up, and drive away, before German sound rangers could even finish processing the audio film on their oscillographs. But constant mobility usually meant tactical blindness. In traditional warfare, a moving gun is a useless gun, temporarily disconnected from its command structure and unable to receive firing orders. The genius of the American system was that the communication network stretched to follow the engines. When an American battery displaced to a new position, they did not wait hours for a surveyor to map their location. The German army has practiced since the First World War. The duel is over. The math was flawless. The shells arrived on target. From a fixed baseline, using optical equipment, they quickly plotted their new grid coordinates on a map, keyed their FM radio, and transmitted their new location directly to the fire direction center. Inside the blackout tent, the FDC simply moved the plotting pin a few inches across the table. The moving battery was instantly reconnected to the invisible brain. The grid was not a rigid chessboard, it was fluid. When the German counter-battery team mathematically pinpointed the first American battery, they found a unit that had stayed in one place just long enough to be targeted. They successfully destroyed it. But when the FDC immediately pivoted and called upon 3 other battalions to retaliate, those units were not static fortresses. They had likely just rolled into fresh firing positions. They were unplotted, fully operational, and completely invisible to the German math. Yet, the ability to constantly move and constantly fire creates an immense physical contradiction. A single artillery battalion unleashing a massive retaliatory strike can burn through tons of steel and powder in a matter of minutes. If the American guns were constantly driving away from fixed supply dumps to avoid German counterfire, how did they ever have enough heavy shells waiting for them in the mud? The answer to the American supply problem was loud, heavy, and relentlessly ugly. The guns did not drive to the ammunition. The ammunition drove to the guns. The enemy battery is disabled, its crews killed or scattered, its heavy cannons neutralized. The German team has cleanly removed a piece from the chessboard. As a displaced American battery dropped its trails into the slush of a new firing position, the sound of grinding gears would echo from the tree line behind them. A 2.5-ton cargo truck, chains wrapped around its tires, would churn through the freezing mud and reverse directly to the firing line. Artillerymen did not have to haul ammunition by hand from a distant rear dump. They pulled wooden crates and black cardboard ammunition tubes straight from the tailgate of the truck, handing them directly to the loaders at the breech. To the German military, an artillery shell was a precious, carefully rationed commodity. Because the Wehrmacht relied on trains to bring supplies to the theater and horse-drawn wagons to drag those supplies to the front, moving heavy tonnage was agonizingly slow. A German battery commander operated under strict daily ammunition allowances. Firing a heavy barrage was an economic decision, calculated against what the horses could realistically drag through the mud the following day. Once a German ammunition dump was established, it was extremely difficult to relocate. The American network treated ammunition differently. It was not a ration to be hoarded. It was a pressurized liquid meant to be pumped continuously through the system. The American supply chain was entirely motorized, built on a foundation of quartermaster truck companies operating in a continuous loop from the ports to the front lines. But sheer volume was only part of the advantage. The true power of the American logistical chain was its integration into the invisible brain. Because the fire direction center tracked the exact grid coordinate of every battery, and because the radios kept the 4 minutes pass, the smoke over the American ridge begins to thin. Then a new sound begins. Command posts informed. The supply network possessed real-time awareness. When an American battery executed a rapid displacement maneuver, the incoming ammunition convoy did not drive blindly to an empty clearing. An officer simply keyed a radio, and the FDC routed the supply trucks to the new map coordinates. The trucks met the guns at their new location. The physical weight of artillery warfare is staggering. A single 155mm projectile weighs nearly 100 pounds. A battalion firing a concentrated barrage consumes thousands of pounds of steel, brass, and explosive powder in a matter of minutes. By motorizing the delivery directly to the firing point, the United States Army bypassed the need for massive, static forward dumps that were vulnerable to German counterfire. They created a bottomless caisson, a mobile supply line that kept the guns fed no matter where they moved. The German observers across the Ruhr River based their mathematical duel on the expectation that the enemy would eventually run out of breath. They believed that even if American guns survived counterfire, constant movement would sever their supply lines and force them into silence. The reality was the exact opposite. Yet, possessing the radios, the central FDC, the mobile guns, and an inexhaustible supply of shells was still just potential energy. A mountain of ammunition and a fast radio network cannot destroy an enemy by themselves. To obliterate the German position in the opening scene, the Americans had to release that energy in a specific, terrifying way. How did the FDC synchronize dozens of scattered, moving, heavily? It is not the distinct, rhythmic thump of a single surviving gun attempting to retaliate. It is a continuous, tearing roar, supplied cannons, all sitting at different distances to strike the exact same German coordinate at the exact same fraction of a second. Inside the fire direction center, the plastic graphical firing scales provided the exact elevation needed to reach the German target. But they also provided a second, far more lethal piece of data: the time of flight. Every artillery shell travels in a parabolic arc, and that journey takes time. A 105mm projectile fired from 3 miles away might take 20 seconds to reach its target. A heavier 155mm shell fired from 7 miles away might take 45 seconds. In traditional artillery doctrine, a commander simply ordered his guns to fire when ready. If multiple batteries shot at the same target, their shells arrived in a ragged, staggered stream. The first impact served as an alarm bell. It gave the enemy infantry or counter-battery crews those precious few seconds needed to dive into a trench, scramble under armor, or press themselves flat into the mud. The subsequent shells would merely churn the dirt above them, causing a fraction of the casualties. The American network eliminated the alarm bell. They weaponized the time of flight to create the time on target, or TOT, barrage. When the FDC decided to obliterate the German observation team and their heavy howitzers, an officer stood by the switchboard holding a stopwatch. He was not commanding a single battery in the mud. The German observers look up to see the sky entirely filled with incoming steel. High explosive and shrapnel shells begin detonating above their trench. He was commanding the airspace over the battlefield. The officer calculated backward from the desired moment of impact. He checked his firing tables. The American artillery battalion farthest to the south had a time of flight of 45 seconds. The FDC radioed the southern battery, counting down until the exact moment required, and gave the order to fire. The heavy guns roared, sending their shells into the overcast sky. The FDC officer watched the sweep hand of his stopwatch. He waited 15 seconds. Then, he ordered the 2nd Battalion, located closer to the target, to fire. Its shells had a flight time of 30 seconds. They left their steel tubes and chased the first volley. He waited another 10 seconds. He gave the order to the final, closest battalion. Their shells had a flight time of 20 seconds. On the ground, the American guns had fired sequentially, miles apart, scattered across the freezing landscape. But in the air, the physics of the FDC's math forced the shells to converge. A flock of high explosive, fired from the north, west, and south, met at the exact same point in the sky above the Ruhr River, at the exact same moment. For the German observers standing in their trench, there was no warning shot. There was no ranging round to correct the aim. The first indication that they had been targeted was the tearing sound of the air ripping apart, instantly followed by the simultaneous detonation of dozens of heavy shells, and over the heavy howitzer battery behind them. The devastation is absolute, but for the surviving Germans, it is the geometry of the incoming fire that defies reason. This was the mechanism that annihilated the German position. The FDC had not simply thrown more ammunition at the problem. They had compressed the destructive weight of an entire artillery division into a single, inescapable fraction of a second. The shockwave stripped the camouflage from the German guns, shattered their optical instruments, and buried their crews before a single man could react. The time-on-target barrage was not a secret. German forces across Europe experienced it, survived it, and wrote reports about its effects. They understood the physical result perfectly. Yet, despite suffering under the weight of this networked system month after month, the German war machine never adopted it. If the Wehrmacht possessed excellent cannons, highly trained officers, and a desperate need to counter American firepower, why could they not simply build a fire direction center of their own? The failure to copy the American system was not a matter of intellect. German artillery officers were among the most mathematically gifted and tactically proficient in the world. They measured the impact craters. They interrogated captured American forward observers. They understood the devastating logic of the fire direction center perfectly. But a military doctrine is not just a clever idea. It is a physical reality bounded by what factories can produce and what logistics can support. The sheer volume of explosives and the angles of descent tell a chilling story. The artillery is not coming from the position they just destroyed. The German war machine could not build an invisible brain because it lacked the physical nerves to connect the pieces. An FDC required instant, reliable, multi-channel communication across dozens of scattered units. The German army simply did not have the radios, while American production lines stamped out tens of thousands of crystal-clear FM sets. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on older, bulkier AM radios. These sets were fragile, complicated to tune, and highly vulnerable to atmospheric static and jamming. Worse, there were never enough of them. German industry could not supply a dedicated radio to every forward observer, let alone wire every battery, command post, and supply truck into a single net. Instead, the Germans were forced to rely on miles of easily severed field telephone wire. When artillery barrages chewed up the copper lines, they had to rely on exhausted human runners carrying written coordinates through the slush. You cannot synchronize a time-on-target barrage across a 10-mile front using a breathless courier. Even if the German army could have somehow transmitted the math, they could not move the machinery. The American FDC relied on motorized prime movers to constantly shift the physical locations of the guns. The Wehrmacht, despite its early propaganda of mechanized lightning war, was fundamentally an army of flesh and bone. In late 1944, they are specialists belonging to an artillery observation battalion, and they are listening to the war through miles of copper wire. It is coming from the north, the west, and the south. The impact patterns indicate 3, perhaps 4 different American artillery battalions. Millions of horses pulled German cannons and supply wagons. A team of heavy draft horses cannot rapidly displace a 1.5-centimeter howitzer minutes after firing a mission. It requires precious time to maneuver the animals, attach the heavy leather harnesses, and pull the massive steel spades from the frozen earth. A horse-drawn battery is tethered to its location. If a German unit fired, it revealed its position, and because it could not easily drive away, it was trapped in the crosshairs of the American network. The rigid German doctrine was not born from stubbornness. It was a necessary survival mechanism forced by these physical limitations. Because German batteries knew their communications were fragile and their mobility was agonizingly slow, their training had to empower the individual battery commander in the field. He was expected to fight his own isolated battle. He had to calculate his own geometry and ration his own shells, because he could not rely on a centralized network to orchestrate his survival. This created a culture of brilliant, localized expertise, but absolute institutional isolation. The German observers watching the sky over the Ruhr River did not just lose a mathematical duel against a better gun, they were crushed by an industrial reality. The Wehrmacht could cast a superior steel cannon tube, and they could forge an excellent high-explosive shell, spread out over 10 miles of the front. Yet, all of these scattered guns fired in perfect synchronization, their shells arriving in the same agonizing fraction, but they could not build the invisible nervous system required to turn those isolated weapons into a unified organism. If the artillery war was not decided by the physical cannons, but by the network that controlled them. What does this reveal about the human cost of the conflict? What was the true price of feeding this massive, mechanized brain? When the German sound-ranging team calculated the exact coordinate of the American battery near the Ruhr River, their math was flawless. They plotted the intersecting arcs on their topographic map. They called in the heavy 5-centimeter shells, and they successfully destroyed the physical cannons. In any previous conflict, that calculation would have guaranteed their survival. But the question on that freezing afternoon was never really about destroying a steel tube. It was about surviving the organism that surrounded it. The German crew believed they were fighting a traditional artillery duel, where the destruction of a weapon meant the destruction of the threat. They did not realize they had merely severed a single nerve ending, instantly triggering a massive, coordinated reflex across a decentralized network. The moment the German shells impacted, the American system reacted. A forward observer keyed a frequency-modulated radio inside the blackout tent of the fire direction center of a second to wipe the German position off the map. The German crew had executed a perfect counter-battery strike. They had found the enemy and silenced him. Enlisted men and junior officers shifted their plastic graphical firing scales across the map. They bypassed the destroyed cannons and instantly pooled the firepower of 3 other motorized battalions. The time of flight was synchronized so perfectly that thousands of pounds of high explosive converged on the German trench in the same inescapable fraction of a second. The Wehrmacht was crushed by this retaliation because they could only see the falling shells, not the invisible architecture producing them. Yet, defining this advantage merely as an invisible network masks the immense physical cost required to keep it running. The system was not an automated machine. It was built, maintained, and paid for by relentless human labor. The Fire Direction Center was not an electronic computer. It was a group of exhausted soldiers, their uniforms smelling of damp wool and stale cigarette smoke, performing life-or-death trigonometry under extreme fatigue. They worked with grease pencils and slide rules, knowing a single mathematical error could drop friendly fire onto their own infantry. The communication web did not exist independently of the men who built it. It survived because signalmen crawled through the freezing European mud, their hands numb, dragging heavy wooden spools of copper wire through shattered forests. Every time a mortar barrage severed the line, a lineman had to leave the safety of a foxhole, trace the wire in the dark, and physically splice the nerves back together. The bottomless supply of ammunition was not an abstract theory, but instead of securing their sector, their success had immediately triggered a disproportionate, flawlessly orchestrated retaliation from an invisible network that seemed to know their exact location. It was the daily reality of thousands of quartermaster troops driving 2.5-ton trucks over ruined, crater-pocked roads without headlights. They fought failing transmissions, slick ice, and profound exhaustion to ensure the heavy crates of artillery shells reached the forward breaches before the guns had to displace again. The German military fought the artillery war with magnificent optical instruments, powerful cannons, and exhausted horses. They relied on local brilliance because their rigid infrastructure could not support a unified, theater-wide brain. The United States military replaced the horse with the combustion engine, the courier with the radio, and the localized commander with the fire direction center. Long after the smoke cleared over the Ruhr River, the German observation trench sat silent. The shattered oscillograph and the broken optical sights lay abandoned in the freezing slush, the final remnants of a doctrine that had calculated everything perfectly, except the true nature of the enemy. Miles away, an American prime mover hitched a heavy cannon to its tailgate. A lineman spliced a fresh copper wire, and a plotter pushed a steel pin into a new map coordinate. The physical guns were gone, but the network was already moving forward. To understand how an army could lose a physical gun battery but instantly strike back with the synchronized weight of an entire division, we first need to understand the rigid, mathematical laws of the artillery duel that the German crew believed they were fighting. The belief that artillery was a rigid, mathematical exchange of coordinates was not a symptom of German arrogance. It was the proven science of European warfare. Since the static, muddy trenches of the First World War, counter-battery fire had operated on a simple, unforgiving premise. The artillery battery was a stationary fortress. To understand why the German observers trusted their math, we must look at what it took to fire a heavy cannon in the 1940s. In a dugout behind them, an oscillograph sits on a wooden table. When an American 105mm howitzer fires from a concealed position beyond the tree line, an artillery piece was not a rifle that could be casually shouldered and fired from a new position. A standard 15cm or 105mm howitzer weighed several tons. Emplacing it required immense manual labor. Crews had to dig heavy spades into the earth to absorb the massive recoil. They had to lay out hundreds of yards of field telephone wire. They had to haul and stack heavy wooden crates of high-explosive shells and powder charges. Most importantly, they had to establish a surveyor's firing grid. An officer using an aiming circle and optical instruments would spend hours calculating the exact topographical relationship between the guns, the surrounding terrain, and the enemy lines. Because of this massive investment of time and labor, an artillery piece, once emplaced, was essentially rooted to the earth. Because the guns were fixed, destroying them was a matter of pure geometry. This was the specialized domain of the German observation battalions. They approached the battlefield as a vast, lethal equation. At night, flash-spotting teams used precise optical instruments to measure the exact angles of enemy muzzle flashes on the horizon. By day, they relied on sound-ranging equipment, using microphones and oscillographs to measure the microsecond delays of a boom rolling over the landscape. The low-frequency sound wave rolls across the battlefield. It strikes a dispersed array of German microphones one by one. Once these intersecting lines met on a topographic map, the target was condemned. The coordinates were passed to German heavy batteries in the rear. The shells were sent, and the enemy position was wiped out. This system worked. It had worked in Poland, it had worked in France, and it had worked across the vast, frozen steppes of the Soviet Union. When a German counter-battery unit successfully calculated a grid coordinate and dropped concentrated high explosives on it, the result was always the same. They found twisted metal, shattered optical sights, dead crews, and a silent sector. Therefore, the German observers shivering near the Ruhr River had every reason to trust the reading on their oscillograph. Their math was perfect. Their shells had arrived exactly on time. The secondary explosions confirmed they had hit a stockpile of ammunition. According to every established rule of the artillery duel, they had eliminated the threat. But this mathematical certainty contained a fatal flaw. The German doctrine assumed that an artillery unit was defined entirely by its cannons. They believed the gun itself was the brain, the weapon, and the center of gravity. If you destroyed the steel tubes, the unit ceased to exist, and the threat vanished. The machine records the minute differences in the time the sound takes to reach each microphone. What the German observers did not understand was that they had not killed the American artillery unit. They had merely severed one finger from a very large, invisible hand. The American military had quietly evolved beyond the physical gun. If the true weapon was no longer the howitzer sitting in the mud, the German geometry was useless. To understand what actually fired back at them, we must look past the cannons and examine the hidden nervous system that connected the battlefield. The true American weapon was not forged in a cannon foundry. It was spun on wooden spools and soldered into steel boxes. To the average infantryman, it looked like simple telephone wire and bulky backpacks. In reality, it was a nervous system that covered Western Europe. Every time an American artillery battalion moved into a new sector, signalmen walked out into the freezing rain, unspooling thousands of yards of W-130 assault wire. They strung it through shattered trees, laid it in muddy ditches, and buried it under dirt roads. An American infantry division might lay over 1,000 miles of wire in a single month of combat. These lines all fed into portable switchboards, hidden in bunkers and ruined basements, connecting the men hiding in forward observation posts. For the German officer in charge, what follows is not a battle of emotion, but a battle of geometry. He reads the film strip from the oscillograph, directly to the rear. But the wire was only the physical foundation. The true revolution was the radio. By 1944, the United States military had saturated the battlefield with reliable, frequency-modulated, or FM, radios. Devices like the SCR-610 allowed forward observers to communicate with crystal-clear voice transmissions, entirely free from the static and atmospheric interference that plagued older AM sets. They did not need to tap out Morse code or wait for a specialized operator. They simply pressed a button and spoke. This created a massive, redundant web of communication. In the German system, an artillery observer was usually tied directly to a specific battery. His job was to find targets for his specific cannons. If the field telephone wire connecting him to his guns was severed by a mortar shell, or if his specific guns were destroyed, the observer was rendered useless. The eye was disconnected from the fist. The American network did not suffer from this fragility. An American forward observer was not tethered to a single group of howitzers. He was plugged into an entire sector. If his primary radio failed, he used a backup. If his wire was cut, he switched to FM. And most crucially, if German counter-battery fire successfully annihilated the guns he was currently directing, he was not effectively disarmed. He calculates the speed of sound through the dense, freezing air. He draws intersecting arcs on his topographic map. He simply keyed his handset and spoke to a different set of cannons. This was why the German mathematical victory at the Ruhr River was an illusion. When their heavy 1.5-centimeter shells slammed into the American 105-millimeter battery behind the ridge, they successfully destroyed 4 steel tubes and the men operating them. They severed one physical nerve ending. But the forward observer who had originally called in those American shells was still alive. His radio was still broadcasting. The German sound-ranging team had punched a hole in the American line, but the network simply routed around the damage. The surviving observer, or perhaps a nearby spotter aircraft, immediately reported the location of the incoming German fire. The warning flashed across the copper wire and FM frequencies, instantly reaching the rear echelons. Yet, raw information is not the same as a synchronized attack. An observer speaking into a radio can report a target, but someone still has to translate that grid coordinate into the complex, unique ballistic math, required for dozens of different cannons, sitting at different elevations and different distances, to hit the exact same spot. A radio signal alone cannot aim a gun. To understand how the network turned a spoken warning into a perfectly timed tidal wave of steel, we have to look at the invisible brain processing the data. Where the lines cross, there is an American artillery battery. It is 4 miles away, entirely hidden behind a forested ridge. The radio signals bouncing across the freezing German landscape did not travel directly to the cannons. They traveled to a blackout tent, buried in a cellar, or hidden under a camouflage net miles behind the front. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, and a group of enlisted men and junior officers stood around a large, flat table covered in topographic maps. They did not touch artillery shells. They held slide rules, acetate overlays, grease pencils, and plastic graphical firing scales. This was the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. It was the most lethal institutional innovation of the American artillery war. To understand why the FDC was so devastating, we must look at what it replaced. In the rigid German doctrine, the mathematical brain of the artillery resided with the battery commander in the field. He received a target, and his own officers calculated the trajectory for their own specific guns. It was a localized process, precise, but inherently isolated. If that commander was killed, or if his guns were destroyed, his targeting capability vanished with him. The United States Army stripped the brain out of the battery and placed it in the FDC. This doctrinal shift completely decoupled the eyes of the Army from the muscle. When the American forward observer or spotter aircraft, but it might as well be painted in bright red on the snow. The officer reaches for his field telephone and transmits the coordinates. Located the German heavy guns firing near the Ruhr River. The observer did not need to calculate the wind speed, the barometric pressure, or the powder temperature. He did not need to know where the American guns were physically located. He simply pressed his radio handset and called in a fire mission, providing the grid coordinates of the enemy muzzle flashes. Inside the FDC, the translation from raw data to lethal geometry took seconds. A plotter pushed a steel pin into the map at the reported German coordinate. Another soldier dropped a specialized plastic tool, a graphical firing scale, over the pin. Because the FDC knew the exact surveyed location of every American battery in the sector, the men around the table could instantly read the unique distance and angle from each individual set of guns to the target. They checked the firing tables for the correct elevation and powder charge. They handed the raw numbers to telephone operators sitting at switchboards along the wall. Those operators keyed their lines and shouted the deflections and elevations directly to the gun crews waiting in the mud. This was the invisible mechanism that doomed the German counter-battery team. By destroying a single American battery, the Germans had only destroyed